Hi, everybody. Much anticipated discussion with Robert Whitaker, who is an author, most notably of Anatomy of an Epidemic. But he is also, I would say, a global leader in the mental health and social justice movement. So he has a lot to say to us. I told him already, I'm not going to bore him with the boilerplate Robert Whitaker tale. But I think I'd like to start, Robert, is how did we get to a place where big pharma and pharmaceuticals came to dominate the mental health system?
Yeah, sure. First of all, Piers, it's nice to be here. Thanks for inviting me. You know, it's just a capitalistic story, basically, is what happens. But what really set the groundwork for it, though, was the American Psychiatric Association in 1980. When it published the third edition of its Diagnostic and Statistical Manual, it said it's going to reconceptualize mental health problems, psychological problems as diseases of the brain. Now, before that, if you go into DSM-I and DSM-II, the first two editions of their Diagnostic and Statistical Manual, there were some things said to be biological in kind. But there was also a lot of sense that, you know, there was Freudian impulses, neurosis is sort of normal, anxiety is a normal thing, and these are psychological problems, et cetera. But what they decided to do, the association in 1980, was to make a big shift. And we're going to conceptualize these problems as diseases. Now, there was no scientific finding that said, oh, anxiety is a biological disease or depression is a biological disease, and it doesn't matter what's happening to you, right? American psychiatry did this because it was a way, in the 70s, there was a lot of questions about the legitimacy of American psychiatry as a medical discipline. Psychiatry was in competition with psychologists and social workers and counselors for patients, et cetera. And so they understood, the association understood that by reconceptualizing these things as diseases, they moved to the top of the heap. Because if you have diseases, it's the medical professionals, it's the doctors who have authority over that domain. So they make this change. And by the way, when they make this change, when you have medical diseases, what becomes a usual primary form of treatment? It's drugs, of course, right? That's why we go to doctors half the time, is to get a prescription. Well, the minute that the American Psychiatric Association did this, the pharmaceutical industry started jumping up and down for joy. Why? Well, because now we were going to start taking all these, you know, we're going to take things like unhappiness, grief, misbehaving kids, that sort of thing. And we're going to now start defining whatever's happening with them, emotions and all, that we used to understand were just sort of things that happen to human beings, as diseases. And the minute they did that, the drug companies could get drugs passed for, you know, approved for that disease. So for example, you're going through a divorce, you're unhappy. There's no diagnosis for unhappiness. You can't have a pill for unhappiness, but you can have a pill for depression as a disease. So really that's what happened. It's very simple, is the American Psychiatric Association reconceptualized the struggles we have as human beings, and which basically happened to everyone at some time in their lives, right?
Sure.
But anyway, they decided we're going to call these diseases. As soon as they do, you open up a market for drugs. And now today, you know, we have about 20% of our adult population on psychiatric medications. And, you know, some colleges report that somewhere between 25 and 30% of their entering freshmen have diagnoses and prescriptions, which just shows you, if you just look at this as a capitalistic story, it's a story of an industry that built a market for its products. Yeah. So that's really what happened. And along the way, of course, pharmaceutical companies began giving a lot of money to the American Psychiatric Association to promote its disease model. They began paying academic psychiatrists to be their speakers, advisors, consultants. And so with that money flow and those joint interests between the guild interests of the American Psychiatric Association and the commercial interests of the drug companies, we got told the story about chemical imbalances and drugs that fix those chemical imbalances, which is a great story of biological progress. It's not true, but it was a great way to market drugs. And we heard how safe and effective the drugs were. And so that's what's happening. What happened? You got to see this as a capitalism, a story about a capitalistic success in essence. You had an industry that built an ever-expanding market for its products, and it's done so with great success. And it used marketing claims wrapped in the gauze of science to do this.
So when we first started hearing chemical imbalance, especially around depression, what was that? With the advent of Prozac, did that go directly with the marketing of Prozac?
Yeah, well, first of all, the first time we began really hearing chemical imbalances at all was in the earlier 1984. There was a famous book by Nancy Andreasen called The Broken Brain. And in there, that's in like 1984, introduces this idea of chemical imbalances. But it's when Prozac comes to market in 1988 that this becomes the way to market the drug. It fixes a chemical imbalance. And that, of course, proved to be an extraordinarily successful market, branding of the drug.
And the industry and even the academy has backed off of that claim. And yet it's still happening in consulting offices. And it's still something of an urban legend. Was that a safe way to?
Well, yeah, here's amazing. This is such a betrayal. So if we really trace the chemical imbalance story back to its roots go back to the 1960s when researchers began to understand how these new psychiatric drugs acted on the brain. So they understood that antipsychotics blocked dopamine transmission, thwarted it. So they hypothesized, well, maybe schizophrenia and psychotic disorders are due to too much dopamine. And then to go forward with the antidepressants, they upped serotonergic activity. So researchers hypothesized, well, maybe depression is due to too little serotonin. So the hypothesis is born not from understanding what's going on in the brains of people so diagnosed, but from an understanding how the drugs act on the brain, because they perturb a normal function, and then hypothesizing the disorder has the opposite pathology. So now, with that hypothesis, they have to investigate, do people with depression have low serotonin before they go on the drugs? Do people diagnosed with a psychotic disorder have too much dopamine activity? Now, listen to this. That story began to fall apart in the minute it began to be investigated in the late 70s. And as early as 1984, the National Institute of Mental Health, our leading research organization in the United States for psychiatric disorders, mental health disorders, conducts a big study to see if people with depression have low serotonin. And what did they find? They didn't find it to be so, okay? That's 1984, that's 4 years before Prozac comes to market. Anyway, once the SSRIs come to market, there's a lot more research onto this. They investigate it from many, many different ways. And then in 1998, the American Psychiatric Association's own textbook says, we investigated this, we tried all this ways, and there's no evidence that low serotonin is a cause of depression, that depressed people have low serotonin. They call it the monoamine theory of mood disorders, is dead, they say. And they even say in their own textbook, this was always sort of a stupid hypothesis because there's no reason that the pathology of a disorder should be the opposite of what the drugs you're using to treat it do. That's 1998. They declare it dead in their own textbook. What does the American Psychiatric Association continue to do after that? Market the chemical imbalance story. You saw it on their website. They even they published, the presidents published articles in magazines saying, we now know that depression is caused by low serotonin. In fact, they even did a public education campaign, a PR campaign, I think it was in 2007, to convince the American public that psychiatrists were experts in fixing chemical imbalances in the brain. So now you do have the experts completely moving back from that publicly because it's been so discredited. The hypothesis has fallen so far apart. I mean, you have Tom Insel, the former head of the NIMH, saying many years ago, yeah, that hypothesis didn't pan out. That's old school. And then we have Ronald Pies, I think, and he was the former editor-in-chief of Psychiatric Times, which is a trade journal. He says in 2011 or 12, I can't quite remember when, he says, the notion of chemical imbalances is a kind of urban myth, never a theory seriously propounded by well-informed psychiatrists. Now, in a way, he's right. Because if you really look at it among themselves, they were always basically saying this is a theory. And then you have these regular findings that the theory's not panning out. By the way, in 1992, I think it was, John Kane, who was a big researcher, still is a well-known researcher in schizophrenia. He writes, dopamine hyperactivity theory of schizophrenia is no longer credible. That's 1992. So in research circles, they did know this, but clearly the guild, the American Psychiatric Association as a guild, told a very different story. Right. Psychiatrists as a profession told a very different story. And even psychiatric residents sometimes were sort of schooled in this nonsense. And of course, so were non-medical people, counselors, psychologists. They got this story too. And it just spread throughout the United States, spread throughout the world, actually, because it became a means to market drugs around the globe, especially in developed countries. I mean, I've traveled quite a bit. This is the common wisdom. So why are we still hearing it? Because there's no propaganda machine really devoted to knocking it down. So yeah, Mad in America, the website I run, we have all sorts of articles knocking it down and blah, blah, blah. But there's just no money in knocking it down. And the American Psychiatric Association doesn't want to go out and say, yeah, we lied to you for 30 years, right? So what happens is it's a myth that just continues to get peddled, and it's false, and it's a betrayal of everybody who's told that. Those patients are being betrayed because if you believe it, well, then you say, I do have something wrong with my brain. I do need to take this drug, and I need to take it forever because I have this abnormality. So it's literally giving people a fraudulent understanding of themselves.
I guess my real question then is, why hasn't there been pushback on a legal front? Have there been settlements that never get any publicity, that sort of thing, or?
I don't understand this. I wish I had a, you would think, I've had many lawyers write me and say, we should do a lawsuit, a class action lawsuit on this very question about, basically fraud within psychiatry with people who got it being told they had chemical imbalances, being given a fraudulent diagnosis. And I don't know why it can't be successful, but basically what they say is that, you'll get experts to say it was a hypothesis and that's how it was really presented. And I guess there's just enough sort of belief that it might have been possible.
Yeah.
That it somehow isn't seen as rising to the level of fraud, but honestly, I don't understand why it wouldn't. I mean, especially after you have their own textbook saying the theory is dead in 1998. It would seem that ever after that, it would be a fraudulent thing to tell patients.
I mean, one thing I can speak to as being somebody in the trenches is there is an enormous taboo even about talking about this. And if you do talk about it, you have to couch things in such a way that you're defending client choice, and maybe there is some symptom alleviation. You know, there's a pervasive fear that if you challenge this hypothesis and you're a social worker or a counselor, it could cost you your job. There's also a fear of people hearing even Robert Whitaker and coming off their meds abruptly, having the bad, rebound effect, whatever you want to call it, withdrawal syndrome. And, so I see that. But it seems to me that the magnitude of the problem is still so great. And your research shows too, or research you look at, that people that are on certain medications for decades, there's a corresponding shortening of life expectancy. Is that not right?
Yeah, well, first of all, divide what you just said into two.
Okay.
This is sort of, you hear this all the time, that if you challenge whatever the conventional story that's been told as a professional, you can get booted.
Yeah.
Especially if you're in a larger, provider system, because it's almost like the provider system has to adhere to whatever the conventional wisdom is, or they'll be challenged as with malpractice or something. And one of the reasons I think that they can't tolerate someone saying, but this isn't true, like the chemical imbalances, is because they actually can't show that it is true. In other words, let's say it were in fact true that these drugs fix chemical imbalances and people had it, and then you all of a sudden are telling people, oh no, that's all nonsense. Well, they could go to you then and say, here's the research that shows you're wrong, and can you please get in concert with the real research. But they can't do that because they can't point to that. I've got to turn this off. Sorry. Sorry, Piers. Someone is desperate to get a hold of me. But they can't do that. And since they can't do it, they end up defensive, and they have to say, we just can't go down that path. It's a type of fear in essence, because if we go down this path, next thing you know, we'll be breaking with everything that people have been told, and it'll just blow up what we've been doing. And the other problem is, if you have an organization that really has organized itself around that, right, that conception, it's hard then to now all of a sudden say, like, were we wrong all this time?
Yeah.
That becomes, all of a sudden, did we mislead our patients?
Yeah.
So, that becomes a real problem too. So, sorry, someone has just called me like 50 times.
Yeah.
You can cut this out, right?
Yeah, that's fine.
Okay. So anyway, that's the problem there, because it's like self-preservation, et cetera. So that's that first part. Like, we don't have honesty between therapist and professional and patient, because the whole sort of system got organized around a false narrative. And once you organize around a false narrative, you're in a really vulnerable spot. You have to say, like, okay, we told you a problem, and because it's a false narrative, you can't really have your own members saying that's false, because it becomes like a really disjointed, it becomes threatening, is the point, to what you're doing and what you are sort of going to be doing in the future. Now, around this idea of drugs, the research on the long-term effects of these drugs does tell of, on the whole, harm done. It tells of people having more physical problems, more chronic symptoms, often more psychiatric symptoms, impairments in their physical health, and all that does get translated into, shorter lifespans, particularly with the antipsychotics. But it's not just the antipsychotics. And then you want to ask, well, why might that be? And this goes back again to what this whole fraud or this whole false narrative. The truth is, we don't know any sort of abnormality that is present with any of these different diagnoses. But what then the drugs do is they perturb normal functioning in the brain. So let's just work with SSRIs, antidepressants. What do? Well, normally serotonin goes into that gap between neurons. That's that chemical messenger. Stays there for just a bit, fraction of a moment, binds with receptors on the receiving neuron, and then it goes back up into the presynaptic neuron stored for later reuse. That's how it works. So what does an SSRI antidepressant do? It blocks that normal reuptake. Serotonin now stays in the gap longer than normal. You're perturbing how the brain was really fashioned by evolution to function,
Right.
Okay? And now your brain, being this incredibly neuroplastic organ, a signal goes out and says, a feedback loop goes, oh, I got too much serotonin in my synaptic cleft. I'm at too high of an activity. So what it does is it tries to dial down its own serotonergic machinery. The presynaptic neurons put out less serotonin than normal, and the postsynaptic neurons, those are the neurons that receive the message, they decrease their density of receptors for this molecule. And you can see why. The drug is acting as an accelerator on serotonergic transmission. The brake puts down, the brain puts down the brake. So, this is why it's so problematic to come off. First of all, you've got this new sort of 1 foot on the accelerator, 1 foot on the brake. Now you take away the drug, and what do you got left? You don't have a normal system. You have a system that's operating in a dysregulated serotonergic state. But also, here's the problem. Do you really think that daily use of a drug that perturbs normal functioning is going to lead to improved functioning over 5 years? Is it going to lead to improved psychological functioning, physical functioning? Because these things are also integrated, right? How your gut works and everything works. Yeah. And basically, if you said to someone, go ahead and take a compound that will perturb your normal function, take it every day for 10 years, how many people would say, like, oh, I think that'll help me live a good life?
Yeah.
That's the problem. So that's but you can't, you're not even really allowed to tell your patients that, right? Or the people, your clients that. Because you're still, at least larger provider organizations are working with this in this sort of framework where the false narrative still exists. Drugs have a beneficial, safe, and effective thing. And if you start warning them against them, you start telling them these harms, and then what happens? They go off. They suffer withdrawal effects. Maybe something bad happens, and who's to blame? You're to blame.
Right. Well, I have a lot of clients who report frequently, or people I know in the recovery world, that they will go to their providers with the idea of coming off of something, valid concerns, and they are strongly, almost often aggressively discouraged from doing it, treated with a certain condescension, really. So they're caught in this dilemma that if they're going to come off, they either have to go to an alternative provider who's out of network, or they just have to wing it themselves. And I see a lot of that.
I know you see a lot of it because I run this website, madinamerica.com, and people write about it all the time. Oh, I wanted to come off. I couldn't get any help. And they discouraged me. It was almost seen that something was wrong with me, that I wanted to come off, and they have to do it themselves. And that's its own peril. Well, there's two things to say about that. One is, again, it's a betrayal of patience from a big picture point of view, because if you're going to be responsible for putting people on the medications, you should develop a way to help them get off the medications, right? That should be the other half of that compact. But we have a system that was pretty quick to put people on and then never learned about withdrawal effects or support people for coming off. And basically, you know, people prescribed these drugs ended up having to like gather together on the internet and forums and sort of talk to each other about what sort of symptoms to expect and how best to do it. So first of all, it's a betrayal of a basic medical function. If you're going to put people on, you should have a way to get people off and help them. I was going to say something else. I mean, that's the biggest thing. It's such a betrayal. I was just going to say one other thing. Sorry about this. It's a betrayal because that's a betrayal because of the responsibility. You're going to have to do a lot of editing here.
It's all right.
Anyway, the second part of this is this. What is the cornerstone of good medicine? It's listening to the individual patient, right? Because people have different responses to drugs. Mm-hmm. And in any corner of medicine, historically, a good thing is to listen to the person being treated. Is the treatment working? Is it doing what you want it to do? And if it's not, maybe we should do something different. So if a person comes to a doctor or a therapist or whatever and says, I want to come off, they should ask why. And if they say, well, you know, actually I'm feeling worse, I'm getting more depressed, I'm lethargic, then they should listen to that and say, oh, okay, that makes sense. It's not doing what the person wants. So it's twofold when we get into this thing about not helping people taper off. One, it's a failure of the medical profession to not have developed methods to help people come off over all these years. And second of all, it's a failure of individual doctor or therapist client relationship not to listen to the person you're trying to help.
Well, that leads to my next question, the issue of chronicity, that conditions that in earlier times were relatively fleeting now become permanent worsening conditions. And we're seeing this a lot, right? And one way to measure this is the huge uptake in the disability roles.
Right.
So we have all these people, if these things had such great efficacy, then why do the mental health disability roles keep going up?
Yeah, I mean, writ large, this is the harm, a big picture of the harm that's being done. So if you go back, say, in the 1970s, early 1980s, and ask people about depression, they'd say, oh, it's something that passes. It's an episode. I'm going to have an episode of difficulty. Anxiety was known to wax and wane and be, common to certain situations. Even psychotic disorders were often understood to be episodic in kind and not permanent, and that they would pass with time. And so the question was, how do you get through those difficult times? So you enter a period of depression. How do you get through it? And maybe you can get some care and treatment that helps you get through it faster. Okay. And by the way, when antidepressants were first introduced, that was the thought with antidepressants. We can shorten the time you're going to be in this episode.
Wow.
But then, and you can even read that. You can read that at the NIMH. They go, listen, 85% of people, even hospitalized depression, will be better after a certain period of time. It will pass. So our whole thing is, can we help speed it up? But then go to the moment they call these diseases of the brain, and they started adopting this chemical imbalance story. Now that's a chronic conception. It didn't arise from scientific discoveries. It arose from a desire to reconceive these things. Well, once you conceive of it that way, they began treating it that way, okay? And the irony is that once people did stay on these drugs that perturb normal functioning, you do see an increase in chronicity. You see an increase in, say, even with, psychotic symptoms, you see that people are more likely to be psychotic over the long term compared to those who end up off medication. With antidepressants, there's increasing body of evidence that over the long term, they increase the likelihood that people will remain symptomatic, have depressive symptoms. And that's just part of it. You also see, for example, with the use of antidepressants, you increase the risk that someone goes from unipolar depression to bipolar, and then they get on these pharmaceutical cocktails. So depression, psychotic episodes, anxiety, all these things got reconceptualized as more chronic conditions. And the irony is, once you start treating that way, it turns out they tend to, in fact, follow that course. And the disability numbers is just like it's a marker of the harm being done. Now, many people, of course, don't end up on disability. But if you have effective treatments for a disease, you should expect that burden of a disease to go down in society, right?
Right.
But in 1987, we had 1.25 million adults on disability due to psychiatric disorders. And that's the year that Prozac comes to market. And now, with 23 years later, roughly, you had close to 5 million people, like a fourfold increase. And you know what was really driving it? Was an increase in disability due to mood disorders, bipolar and depression. Now, when I wrote Anatomy of an Epidemic, people said, oh, that's just because the United States is a horrible country and they have no safety net. So I was asked to appear before a work group in the United Kingdom's Parliament because they were seeing the same rise in disability due to mood disorders. So in preparation of that, I began looking at rising use of antidepressants in developed countries and correlating that with their rise in disability numbers. And in every country, it goes up in like step-like fashion. As people increase their use of these medications, you see an increase in disability. So, there's also been studies of cohorts where they find that those who go on antidepressants, for example, there was a large study in the 1990s on this very question, and that people who went on antidepressants were 7 times more likely to become disabled than those who didn't go on the medication.
And do you see this anywhere, this model of mental health is being exported?
Oh, yeah, it's being exported around the world.
Yeah.
Got exported to Europe, it got exported to South America, it got exported to Australia, New Zealand, and increasingly they're trying to export it to like Asian countries, African countries.
So, from where I sit, you take what we just talked about, you just described, and then you also have the advent of chronic pain syndrome, starting in the 90s. And so I see a lot of people are getting disability for one or both of those things. Whereas prior to the 90s, pain was a symptom.
Right.
It was not its own, it was not a medically treatable diagnosis, right? But there has to be also I'm pushing back on you a little bit, I think. There has to be some correlation to the contraction of the middle class, the crash of 2008. I expect it will be with COVID as well, that the disenfranchised, because they don't have other safety net alternatives, feel pushed to go down this road.
Yeah, no question.
The States.
No. It appears you're right. And of course, under Clinton, we basically got rid of welfare, okay?
Right.
So, and there's been, a lot of people don't have health care. If you go on disability, you generally can get health care through, Medicaid or whatever, because you enter into a category of poverty that allows you to get health care. There's no question that helped fuel it, okay? No question. But that's why I think to see that it's still real is that it also is happening and happened in countries with good social, support nets. So, for example, it happens in Sweden. I mean, the UK's has been, falling apart, but it happened in New Zealand. New Zealand has a really lot of social support, but it happened in New Zealand as well. It happened in Australia. It happened in every country I could chart both the disability numbers and the use of antidepressants. It happened in Iceland. Iceland, for example, has a great safety net. So is it exacerbated in the United States by social conditions, the decline of the middle class? Absolutely. The sort of getting rid of welfare? Absolutely. Disability became a landing spot for people cut off from other types of support. And so, for example, a lot of parents would, once they lost basically the child welfare support, they would like to get their kids diagnosed with ADHD and seen as disabled so they could get a payment through their child. Now, the problem was, of course, then they had to pimp out their child and the child had to go on these medications. But sure, there's all sorts of social factors that are driving these disability numbers. And as you said, chronic pain is one now. You see a lot of people claiming back pain as a way to get on social, on disability. So,
I mean, that is some of the most shocking part of your research, that we have astronomical numbers of children on disability, ever increasing, I'm assuming.
Well, it seems to have leveled off some, but that's because they're putting the brakes on approving some. They see this rising expenditure, right? So states can they can set up different sort of review processes for allowing people on disability. And as these disability rolls have swelled up, it becomes such an expense. And then now you see states and frankly the federal government trying to make it harder to get on disability. So, I haven't seen the data for like the last 4 years, but I think it was like around 2017, it stopped this ever upward trend and it began to level off.
Probably varies state to state, I would assume too.
Oh, and it varies a lot state by state, depending on, how much they want to cut off,
It seems
state funding.
It seems like it runs parallel with the whole prison question. That some states were getting devastated by those costs, so they started doing some reform.
Yeah.
Okay, so larger question, a couple before we stop. One is, we seem to be acculturated into this idea that emotional problems are essentially individual. They're not contextual, they're not relational. And it would seem to me that that's where a lot of pushback should happen. And I do see it in fields like anthropology, sociology. I do not see the question even come up in curriculums of psychology, human services, social work.
Yeah, that's a great point, Pearson. We got, along with the rise of the disease model of psychological problems, we entered into a time of neoliberalism, right? We have Thatcher and Reagan going back to 1980. And neoliberalism, the whole point is to saying that the problems exist within the individual, right? And not within societal constructs, whether it be paying living wages, supporting unions, et cetera. The problem was inside the individual. And the chemical imbalance thing really, fed into this idea. Oh, the problem is in you. It's in the kid. It's not in the schools. Are the schools boring or underfunded? Or maybe just the way the schools are organized is a problem. Or maybe is it a problem that people are working 2 jobs to try to put food on their table? Or they don't have security anymore, or they don't have access to healthcare, or they live in a society where the wealth is so incredibly unequally distributed and getting more so every day, basically. So mental health arises, I'm quite sure, within cultures, within larger conditions. And we know, for example, that the data is real clear on this. Cultures where the wealth distribution isn't so great, they're happier cultures. And so if we really want to sort of, as a society, rethink this, you have to rethink, like, how do you build a nurturing society that nurtures good physical health, that nurtures good emotional health, that nurtures relationships, that nurtures a social interaction with each other, nurtures a sense of civic duty, a belonging to, not two warring tribes, but, to some, unified country that we want to see prosper. So ultimately, you see a dual failure, I think. You see a failure of the disease model as just like a disease story, right? It was a false story, and it's failed in terms of treating people individually. But it's not enough to just say, okay, let's reconceptualize what's going on inside the individual's head. You have to reconceptualize, how do you as a society help people stay well? How do you build a nurturing society for your children, for your mothers, for your working people, and the whole gamut? And clearly what we've had over the first 40 years is a society devolved into places that's not very supportive of people. And by the way, addictions, I think, are reflective of that.
Yes.
That this sort of social unhappiness, and we've lost it, a way to help people make a transition from childhood into adulthood. Mm-hmm. So addiction is just like, it's a marker for a society that has really fallen apart.
Yeah, canary in the coal mine for sure.
Absolutely.
Given all of this, and given that you have this broad bandwidth or exposure to other countries, is the face of activism on these issues look different in places in Western Europe than it does here? Are we really hamstrung here because of corporate personhood and money being speech and corporations being people? Or is the activism comparable here to other places?
Well, in some ways, I think the activism is quite pronounced here. And I think that's, there's several reasons for this. Whenever you have an extreme society, it's more likely to provoke a response. Okay? Mm-hmm. So since we have had such a grotesque and ever-growing unequal society, and a society where it's harder and harder to feed your family and that sort of thing, and schools are so unequal in quality and funding, that provokes an activism. That's number one. Second, I think, and there's quite a bit of reaction to our corporate environment as well for that. But two, what also happened here is the psychiatric expansion that occurred starting with, Prozac, which was so great. We began to pathologize kids. That began to trap a lot of people who were quite skilled, came from upper class homes, or,
that's right.
Okay, and even went to some of the best schools. And then all of a sudden they weren't flourishing. Okay, all of a sudden their lives were going down the tubes. And then they started going like, what happened to me? And they can see that when they went down the psychiatric path, their lives went to crap. And in a way, the fact that some of the people who are getting caught into the psychiatric system come from, higher classes, or better, when we talk about fiscally better classes, that's also being leading to a fountain of activism as well. Because you do have people with other means, in essence, other resources, able to really devote themselves to it. And sometimes, they've had the educational skills to be good writers about this, that sort of thing.
Yeah.
And so, like, take Sweden. Sweden, you almost see no activism.
Really?
Almost none. And the reason is, I think there's such a sort of still sense of social togetherness there, and they don't really want to challenge the prevailing wisdom. There isn't that streak of independence. So you don't see much activism there. Now, Norway, you do. But Norway has a different political system that for the longest time really sort of nurtured grassroots grassroots power, even in the medical system. So for example, every hospital system has to have patients on their board or some sort of decision board.
Wow.
So the system itself has a way of supporting dissent from conventional wisdom, even dissent against the medical system or challenges to that. So for example, the longest running psychiatric survivor group I know of comes from Norway. It's a group called We Shall Overcome, and you can recognize the historical echoes of that name. And it was the user groups in Norway that, for example, forced the health ministry to order all hospital districts to start offering medication-free treatments. So that was a grassroots movement. So by and large, I would say the psychiatric survivor movement, or just what, if you want to call it the peer recovery movement, is more active in the United States than most anywhere else. Norway is sort of an exception.
Wow, that is so interesting. I would have thought the opposite.
By the way, one more thing, Piers.
The opposite.
Oh yeah, I know I would have thought the opposite too, but you know what another reason is? The civil rights movement in the United States. Because we had a civil rights movement, that really helped stir a rights movement among ex-mental patients, people who'd been in mental hospitals in the 70s, which really seeded the psychiatric survivor movement. So you add all those factors up, more capitalism, more inequality, more pathologizing of kids, in the history of the civil rights movement, it really seems to have bred, a pretty active psychiatric survivor movement in the United States.
So there's going to be a lot of people in this audience who would identify as psychiatric survivors and people in recovery. Many of them are like 12-step sponsors, and so they're trying to help people that are embedded in these systems. And in terms of, do you have any advice in terms of organizing resources? How to have
psychiatric survivors?
Psychiatric survivors, but those who are coming into this perhaps through the recovery thing?
Yeah. Well, first of all, this website I run, Mad in America, is meant to provide resources where you can research the drugs, you can research the merits of the diagnoses, you can read personal stories. Now, all of that can help you feel less isolated, less alone, more confident and you can feel validated. And more confident, I think, in even if you go, say, for example, you mentioned people who go to their provider and say, hey, I'd like to taper down. If they're told no, can't get support, if they've informed themselves of these resources and seen that they're not alone, I think that can help them be more confident in their decision making and in their assertion of whatever they want to do. Because people should do, they should be the author of their own lives.
Yes.
And they should decide whether they want to do this or not. So, for example, I'm not encouraging anyone to do anything, but other than maybe get informed. Try, if you're questioning this, become informed. And then I think there is, secondly, a lot of wisdom in the peer community.
In the what?
In the peer community, in listening to people who've walked down these paths. So I think, being able to gather with others that have had similar experiences can be very helpful. And then that's the second thing. Third thing I would say, do try to reconceptualize it for yourself, and you don't see yourself as forever damaged.
Yes.
See yourself as someone who struggled. You're a human being that exists in an environment. You grew up in an environment. To struggle is to be human. And you said about resilience, we're not the same people throughout our whole lives. We change. And there's a big humans can be so resilient.
Yes.
They can chart new paths in life. So cling to that as a form of hope, a form of truth, so to speak, that human beings do have resilience, they can make changes. So I think that's the information is think of yourself not as broken. Think of yourself as a human being who's suffered, who's struggled, who's maybe made mistakes, but we can change our ways. And then if you can inform yourself about these things, reach out to other peers, maybe reach out to professionals who are willing to listen or are already sort of in this world of thinking about things differently. And I think if you want to make a change, if a person wants to make a change, all of these factors help them put them on a path where they can start going in a different direction.
So I have to do it. The viewer that's saying, well, this is all well and good, but in my case, I'm taking the Depakote and I feel a lot better. What do we say to him?
Great. No, I'm serious a little bit here, Piers. If someone says, listen, my life is going well, and I find that this drug helps me do that. That goes back to this thing of honoring the perspective of the person who's the individual. They are the authors of their own lives. And if they want to continue taking the medications they find helpful, that's great.
Yeah.
At some point, though, at some point, if they change their mind, I know a lot of people who said for a time these were great, and then all of a sudden they stopped being great.
Yeah.
There's a time then at that point to help them find information, that sort of thing. I guess what I'm trying to say is, you want to be a source of information. You want to be a sense of encouragement. You want to help people see themselves as authors of their own lives, as able to change themselves. And then they can make their decision whether they think the medications are good for themselves. And, and if they're helped, great. I honestly mean that. Because when we talk about the drugs doing overall harm, that is in the aggregate. It doesn't mean everybody has the same reaction to the drugs. And it also means this. So let's go back to depression just real quickly. If the natural recovery rate, where you're just asymptomatic a year later, is 85%, now let's say on drug it's 50%.
Yeah.
Well, you got 50% of the people saying, oh, I think the drugs are helping me because they're not symptomatic. But still, in the aggregate, you've done harm because the recovery rate went from 85% to 50%. But all I'm trying to say is that group that is in the category of, I find these very helpful. Okay, that's great. I honestly wish, as long as we were using these drugs, everyone would find it that way. Sometimes, though, you will ask people, they'll say, oh, these are great. And then they'll say, well, but, my sex life sucks.
Right.
And, I'm not very energetic, and I find that I'm not as interested in things. And then maybe that's something to explore. Any drawbacks, anything you see that maybe you'd like to change. Maybe that leads to a lower dose. I don't know. But I just want to emphasize the person is in control of their lives. They're the ones making the decisions.
Yeah. We're at a point where you have things that are alternative modalities that are really well researched, especially by neuroscientists. We're at a point where yoga is identified as being a complementary form of medicine. but we're not at a point where insurance will reimburse for these things. I'm assuming that's in Norway, they are getting reimbursed.
No, there's a lot more reimbursement for
Yeah.
these sort of social support programs.
Is there any push towards that in the United States? Any activism?
Yeah, I do think you see there is some activism, grassroots activism, wanting these non-medical alternatives, supported by health insurance, yoga, exercise clubs. There's a lot of different things. Whatever the mindfulness practices might be.
Right.
What one wishes is this, that there really would be insurance. So insurance is for diseases, right?
Mm-hmm.
You should have insurance for promoting wellness. You understand what I mean?
Right.
And that I think there's a tiny bit of that, but not really. So it should, honestly, I think insurance should cover, why not cover yoga, exercise classes for people, having someone come in and help you with your diet, all these sort of things. So I think there is a bit of a push for that. And one of the reasons, of course, that there's a push for that is, if you can promote wellness in a person, they're much less likely to use health services that are very expensive.
Yeah.
So wellness protocols can be very cost effective for insurance companies, or providers, I should say. But we have a long way to go, as you know, on this. I think that the activism is there, but it's long, long, long way to go.
Well, Robert, you've been very informative and very generous with your time. So maybe if folks want to find you, madinamerica.com.
Yeah, and if they want to write me, they can just go to contact and find my email there.
Oh, right. I highly recommend it. It's a one-stop shopping resource, and it also will send you in other directions too. So it's really a wonderful thing. And with that, thank you so very much.
Piers, thanks for having me. I really enjoyed it.